So let's get into this. From humble beginnings, you know, it was 1967 when legislation changed and started to allow condominiums in Ontario. It was a brand new thing. I remember hearing about it, working as a young lad in a little company called Kodak, and one of my fellow workers said, "I just bought a condominium." And I said, "Why on earth would you buy an apartment?" It just didn't make sense. It didn't register. Who knew what it would lead to? I remember when he said, I just bought an apartment, and I said, well, the next thing you know, people will be paying to drink water. Here we are. 1967, and it was around 1968-69 when people started moving in. And let's put it in a little perspective here for you. In those early days, people bought these apartments. They really didn't know what was going on. Like early settlers, they didn't know what to expect. They got elected, they got onto this board, they looked at their one-page declaration and said, how am I going to do this stuff? We need some help. Even drove some people to drink. And so it was the birth of condo management way back then. And it was based on needs. It wasn't a planned growth. Condo boards came and said, well, we need some help. We need somebody that can do this banking. I've got a day job. Things like that. A few people stood up and said, I think I can do that for you for a few dollars. And that's where we started as managers way back then. It was a cottage industry mindset because we didn't know what we didn't know. So we started to learn, we started to grow with these condos in Ontario, and quickly boards figured out one thing. They knew it was too much. They didn't know all of those other things, but they knew it was too much. And if you look at today versus the act back in those days, well, let's take you on a journey. The Condominium Act 1970 had 25 sections in it with no reference to procurement. How are we going to spend people's money? How are we going to protect their money and their privacy and all of those other things? It just didn't exist in those days. Then along came the first change in 1978, and wow, what a change that was. It jumped up to 63 sections. How would we ever learn that? There was panic throughout the industry, but still nothing about procurement, nothing about protecting people's money. The next change came in 1998, and it was that transition when I jumped into this business. And I had to learn the 1978 Act, and then I had to learn the new Act in 1998 with 183 sections. I figured it would take my entire career to learn that. Then along came 2015 with Bill 106 and the revisions to the Condominium Act 1998. We were still only floating around with Section 97 and 98, which more or less controlled the board's methodology for spending money, but really didn't reach beyond that. Clearly, more was needed. So in Bill 106, they contemplated something. It's supposed to come in the next wave of regulation. There is one reference to following proper procurement as prescribed, and then when you go to the regulations, there's nothing there. So again, what we're doing is we're sitting in the same place we were back in 1970 when managers first started to emerge and look after condominiums. So where's the protection? And what will be the trigger, I wonder, as we move forward to start to become a little more formal in what we do? In my opinion, in my humble opinion, about 75 to 80% of every action that happens in a condominium between the manager and the board ends up being an expense. It's rooted in procurement. So procurement isn't just how you spend money. It's how you prepare to spend the money, how you record the spending, et cetera. It really is quite a formal process. I've been spending a lot of time with my very good friend, you may know him or her, Google, and I've been looking at the various procurement policies around the country. And when you compare even the mildest policy to the regulations in the Condominium Act, It's striking how little there is. And I'm talking about relatively simple procurement policies and processes in other industries. So today, loose protocols. I mean, there's a lot of times where the board will simply say, hey, go get that. And you go get it, and that's it. That's sort of the whole process right there. It's very loose. In the marketplace today, I mean, I speak with managers from right across the whole gamut, in fact, coast to coast in Canada. I talk to directors coast to coast in Canada, and there is absolutely no consistency in the market. There's the odd management firm that has very, very strict and rigid protocols for procurement, but then you get boards who say, that's too much, we're volunteer, can we tone it down a little? And then when you see the pendulum swing the other way, there's absolutely nothing there. It is all over the place. You would think that a purchase order is a pretty basic thing in the industry. And yet, there are so many corporations and that inconsistency in the marketplace, so many people occasionally with, but most without purchase orders. I know this because as I talk to managers and I see the invoices that are being paid across different management companies, different condominium corporations, the purchase order is often the property manager's name or the corporation's name. That's not proper procurement. That's not proper tracking. Now, I'm not up here telling you that what I'm going to describe today is something that even my firm is 100% immersed in, but it is where we're going. And it's where we're all going. Whether we like it or not, we're going to end up there. We have to. We have to be more diligent. Part of the problem, and we see this all the time, especially in Toronto with rapid growth, is some senior from a management company goes and meets with the board of directors and says, you should hire me, and here's all the things I promise you. And then in today's environment, we go out and we try like crazy to find a qualified manager to put in that property to fulfill those promises. That's a difficult thing to do if you consider that there are nearly 11,000 condominium corporations in Ontario and only 2,800 licensed managers. The math doesn't add up. We're coming into a collision here in the very near future. But when we put that manager there, we expect that manager is going to deliver what we promised in that meeting. And sometimes that doesn't always happen. I hear all the time, it's a volunteer board. A corporate or structured approach to procurement is too much for them. They're volunteers. You don't want to get into all of that. I hear that both from managers, I hear it from the principals of management companies, and I hear it from directors. However, the environment is changing. You know, today, it's all good, right? Until it isn't. And when it isn't, and you go back and look at some innocent purchases like the one I just described, if you go in with an agenda to place blame and show wrongdoing, there isn't enough structure there to defend the action, even though the action is probably defendable. And we see it right across the board. So this, if you're going through this or you think you're more structured, I'm telling you, it's all over the place. Absolutely no consistency in this market. And what does that do? What does that expose directors and managers and even some service providers to? Well, people come on with a single agenda. We see that very often. They run for election on the board and say, listen, I'm going to clean up the West here. I'm the new sheriff. Hire me, and all of this misspending and misappropriation and all these wrong things are going to stop. And if you go in and look at the way some of the procurement has occurred, certainly the record keeping, it's easy to say, see, I was right. And the reality is it probably was a legitimate expense or procurement, but just not recorded properly. The steps required to protect everybody weren't in place. We also have forensic audits that take place now. So when a relationship breaks down between a management company and a condominium corporation, The corporation goes out and hires somebody, says, do a forensic audit. I'm not happy with what's going on, and I wonder if there's something behind the scenes. And again, if you do a forensic audit, you want to make sure you have all your I's dotted and your T's crossed, which we should have been doing and should be doing in the first place. Sometimes we get deferment or ignorance of responsibility. Now, what kind of a statement is that? My goodness. I think what I'm saying here is over the years, you know, from 1970 until 2019, there's been this shift of responsibilities that are clearly the responsibility of the board that have just fallen on to property managers. Remember that the management contract that you have is an agency agreement, and there's a fiduciary obligation to the client to look after the property correctly. It's too easy, and it happens far too often, where directors who should be retaining some responsibility download that to the manager. And again, as I said before, that's all good until it isn't. That's when they start to play the blame game, right? I call it the corporate salute. You've probably all seen it, right? That's where you go, whose fault is it? Theirs, right? That's the way the corporate salute works. I come out of the corporate world, I know that. Litigation is a new get-out-of-jail-free card, and we're seeing this, and I talk to principals of management companies across the board. The amount of litigation that's occurring, the larger the firm, the more frequent firms are named in litigation, whether it's valid or not valid. Remember that the litigation game says, look, we'll blame everybody, and in the end, when we get to court, one or two will be found responsible, and I'll get something out of it. And so they play this game, and that way you're deferring what was somebody's responsibility, and you're just clouding the issue. And this brings me to the last point up here, how that affects a condominium manager's license. This is a new world, and in November of 2017, when licensing was introduced for managers, managers had to stop and say, listen, there's a code of ethics, there's a process, and if I don't follow it, I could lose my license. I could lose my livelihood, right? It doesn't mean that I can move to another city and just open up shop and start practicing again. I've lost my license. I can't practice in Ontario. Also the firms, same thing, same pressure on the firm. If a manager does something wrong and it's reported to the condo authority, then the next step is to prove they didn't do something wrong. And so everything has shifted a little bit. I wanted to talk about all of this because I wanted you to understand that the manager looking after your property now has a personal vested interest in making sure that they look after procurement the right way. There's a vested interest. If I don't do it right, I could get in trouble. Since November 2017, I have said no to clients more than I have before 2017 in all of those years of service. They've asked me to do something that was not correct or not following the act or blatantly contrary to the act, and I've said no. I'm not going to put my license at risk for this. And you're going to hear that more and more as we start to see managers lose licenses. We've seen a couple already, and that's good. We're in a bit of a transition period, but it's going to have a major effect on procurement and the way that that's handled. Condominium Management Services Act. So let's take a little look at history then. Very often we'll see that there's talk at a board meeting. For example, listen, I noticed the landscaping in one of the trees is dying. You need to go out and get some quotes and see if we can get that fixed and how much it's going to cost. It's a very loose request. We get these loose requests for some action, it doesn't matter what it is, that typically has a dollar value attached to it. The one I really like to talk about is when somebody says, okay, call a lawyer and get an opinion on that. That's coming from the board. That's coming from the people who are most protective of their funds. But think about that. Call a lawyer and get an opinion on that. If I was a lawyer, that's a 15-page opinion at X dollars per word. What it should have been was, we have this issue going on, here's 3 questions we need answered, and the board has approved a $3,000 maximum limit on that opinion. If it's going to cost more, you have to come back to us. That's protecting money. That's proper procurement. And that would be written on the purchase order sent to the lawyer. Lawyers are not exempt from a formal process. Just walk into their office and ask them how they handle procurement, and you'll see it's much more formal than what they're expecting from their clients. Then after this little request that we get, we pick up the phone, we call somebody, we say, hey, you know, we need that tree looked after. There might be a set of specs. There might not. There might be a purchase order. There might not. There might be pre-approvals on record from the board of directors, or there might not. And usually it's the later, because we talked about it at the board meeting. Everybody knows we sent you off, go do it, take care of it. Then we get an invoice. The job is done, we get an invoice. And there's a lot of problems that can occur just before this invoice happens. I can tell you, I've sat in the boardroom where the board wants to talk about a particular invoice before they sign the check because we asked for a service, but that's not what we asked for. Now, how many times have you talked to somebody and you say something to them and they respond completely differently because they didn't hear what you were saying? They heard what they wanted to hear or what they thought you were saying, right? And so one way around this, especially when you're preparing to spend somebody else's money, whether it's $1 or $1 million, there should be some approval, not just for the expense and starting to incur that, but some approval on the specifications. Now that's interesting because we don't see that a lot unless it's a CCDC or a project managed contract, something through the reserve fund, where you've got an engineer there. Now specs can be relatively easy. Hey, the tree is dead, I need to replace it. How old is the replacement? What's my cap? What am I been pre-approved to spend on behalf of the board? I write that in a purchase order. The board approves the purchase order. Now later on, there's no confusion as to whether or not I heard what they said, right? Or did I hear what I thought they said? So then we send it through with a check request. And that's usually, and the norm in the industry is that's an invoice with a check request on it. Occasionally you might get a work order that's attached to that. Somebody left a work order at the site. Sometimes you'll get a little description of it, but very often it's just that invoice. And it gets paid. And so this is a legitimate process. What I'm saying is the board was aware of it, the board requested it, we went through that process. We don't have a renegade manager, we don't have a renegade director. Everything is going along great. But how does that look later? If somebody wants to look at that and they come in with a single-minded agenda to prove that something wrong was going on, how does that procurement and how does the history look? Let's look at a typical small expense. This actually comes, this is something that happened to one of my managers. A director walked into the office and the director said, "It's really cold in here." And the manager said, "Yes, it's always cold in the office here." The director said, "You should get a heater. They're cheap." Makes sense, little heater, plug it in, put it by your feet. You're in the office all day. The manager goes to Amazon, gets on the computer. Hey, there's a nice little heater there, just what I need, 30 bucks. We'll order it. Gives their credit card number. They give their credit card number and they wait for that credit card bill to come back. There's the proof of payment. Submit that. Chances are it's under the spending limit, and many condominium corporations set that spending limit so that we don't hold up the business of the corporation with small and minor expenses. I would say to you, though, that if it isn't contemplated in the budget, It doesn't matter if it's a small expense. You still need to go to the board and say, look, I need to spend $1, $30, $300, $3 million, but you never contemplated this in your budget. Do you approve it? Before you incur the expense and before the corporation is bound to pay that invoice. And because it's under the spending limit, many management agreements say that within that limit, just 2 management signatures will get that through. Of course, the board sees everything in their financial statement, what way it goes. This is not unusual in our industry to see procurement like this. It happens every day. The reason that as managers we're good at what we do is because we reprioritize and address things almost hourly. How many, I see a few managers here, we come to work in the morning and say there's only 4 things I want to do today. And when you come to work tomorrow, you say there's only 6 things because there was 2 added and I didn't get to yesterday's things. And that's the way it goes. It constantly is a reprioritization of what's going on at the condominium. If you've got open and office hours and the owners are coming in, all sorts of things are hitting you. Oh yeah, I got to get that heater. Let me just order that really quickly. That's typically the way it happens. We're dealing with other things. This little $30 expense doesn't mean much. All is good until it isn't. So what's so unusual about that? Well, no minuted description of the problem. No items are formalized to trigger this expense. There's no pre-approval of specifications or any approvals at all on file. Typically in the management industry, some were directed to do something, and the directors really see the result of that when they have to sign some checks. There's no clear purchase order in place. Purchase order is the contract to make sure that you're getting what you're supposed to be getting. It's also the thing that you measure receipt against. There's no proof of receipt typically today. This is a new concept. In a CCDC project, a large construction project that has an engineer overseeing it, you get a clearance certificate along with the invoice. Somebody is saying, here's proof of receipt of goods or services. It is what it's supposed to be as measured against the contract. It's okay to pay this. We see that all the time. Statutory declarations, all the subcontractors have been paid. So the engineering community is interacting with the condominium corporation in a more formalized procurement process. So it seems that boards are open to it if somebody else is doing the project management on it. But this proof of receipt of goods and services, I've been going through in my paid gig, looking at the problems that arise and things like that. That's sort of my issue. And I can't tell you, even though we have educational programs, there's still those cases that arise where there was a board meeting, here's a copy of the management report, here's a copy of the minutes, here's a copy of the specifications, and then the bill got paid. But did we ever get the goods or services? There's no proof in that package that they were received. So later on, a few years later, somebody comes in, maybe that person who has a single-minded agenda to get on the board by showing that everybody else is wrong or trust has been lost, it's a forensic audit, doesn't matter what it is. You come in and you look at that and you say, well, okay, I see that everything was minuted okay and it's all in there, but it's summertime, I don't see the heater anywhere. And in fact, I don't see anything that says you even received the heater. Did that go to a director's house? Is that in the manager's basement? Those are reasonable questions when you look a year or two later at that procurement process. And why are they reasonable? Because you never recorded it properly and you didn't take all the steps to justify that procurement. Seems awfully formal when we talk about the workings of a condominium corporation. But more and more, even the smaller corporations are having $1 million plus in their reserve fund. Their operating funds start to build up. We're talking about a lot of money. And I'll tell you what, if you were all managers, and you were looking after my money, I'd be asking a lot more. So what I'm describing here today, I believe, is the wave that's going to come across the province probably in the next 12 to 18 months. I know there's a lot of people who have been waiting for this, but the problem with what's going on, no audit trail. Was the purchase justified? Did you have specifications? Did you receive the goods as specified? Was it paid? How was it paid? We don't get that full audit trail. That's a long way from an invoice with a check request, right? Now, look, when everything's going well, that's good. I mean, you asked to get that tree fixed. Here's the invoice. You paid to get a new tree. Fantastic. Everything is good until it isn't. Now, fiduciary obligation goes a couple of different ways. As a management company, our management contract is the agency agreement and places upon us that fiduciary obligation to our clients. But the board of directors has a fiduciary obligation to their constituents. You have an obligation under the Condominium Act for due diligence and to do things that protect the condominium and nurture the condominium. And I don't want to say that everybody's been wrong, but I'm going to say everybody's been wrong. We've been doing this the wrong way. This is not a needs-based business anymore. This is a regulated, licensed business. And those people that think that going corporate, and I use the word corporate, it could be formal, going corporate is just too much for a volunteer board. But I tell you what, you know, one of my clients has a $9.5 million a year budget. Their reserve fund is currently sitting about $8 million. And they've hired a manager, and that manager, to some degree, has some control over those funds. That's an awful lot of trust placed on a third party. That third party had better get online with what's coming down the track. So what does that angry person see? Well, let's see. No previous indication of it being cold in the office. There was no minuted approval. There's no signatures. No purchase order. It's summer. I can't find the heater. The payment was made to the manager. Uh-oh. I bet they have the heater at home. It's reasonable, though. It's reasonable. Because if you try to prove that this was a normal procurement process, that it's all legitimate, where's the paper trail? We're now a couple of years later. A lot of trouble could happen there. So what's the corporate approach? And here's what I'm going to propose to you. You build a business case. The manager has to build a business case to present to the board. I don't want to scare you managers that are in the room. A business case could be a condition survey provided by an engineer. It could be a dead tree. What kind of business case? Here's a picture of a dead tree. I want to put this 3-year-old tree in its place. But all of that has to be recorded. That's your business case. The management report, this is funny, a little bit of an aside. The management report, most boards feel that the management report is one of their documents. Oh, I like to see it laid out this way, and I want a little spreadsheet on the back, and I want it to be this, and I want it to be that. And with all due respect, directors, that's not your document. That's the management document presented to you. That's our way to steal the agenda for a few minutes, to get the business out of the way so we can carry on business until the next meeting. And if there's a business case to be made, you can put a sentence or two, or a paragraph, or an addendum to that management report. It comes in all different forms. The bottom line is, it's a historical document on why a purchase is required. Get specifications. Now, some of them, like I said, we'll replace it with a 3-year-old maple tree. There's your specs. That can go right on a purchase order. Sometimes it's a little more complicated. Recently, I heard a story at one of the CCI events where a director came up and said, look, we were in a meeting and we told the manager that we wanted 3 new benches in our garden area, and we wanted the ones that are near the entrance, just like that. The trouble was, right near the entrance, there was 2 benches, and they were both different styles. So the manager picked the one that looked best, at least to the manager, and ordered 3 more. When they arrived, now the commitment's already been made, when they arrived, the board said, no, we didn't mean that one, we meant that one. Had there been agreement on the specifications up front, there would be no crossed messages going through. So it's critical to get those specifications approved by the board. I threw this in here because I wanted to give you a hint of what's coming. Determine what level of procurement this is. I've just talked to you about 2 levels, haven't I? I talked about a CCDC project managed procurement level. This is where you hire that project manager to look after things. And I also talked about within a spending limit. And that's reasonable. Well, within a spending limit, if you think about the exposure, you know, they're usually around $2,000, $2,500. That's going to be revealed at the next management or the next board meeting. So if something's wrong, the exposure is $2,500, but business gets to carry on. As long as this isn't abused, you have a purchase order approved and go to tender. Now look, if you're going to get the tree, you can do all of this before you walk into the board meeting. You've already got it in your head. You've probably got some of it written into your management report, but the board needs to see it from the start of establishing the reason all the way through to approving the purchase order. And I would say that the purchase order, anything over the spending limit, should be signed by at least 1 director, right? You see, it's a shared responsibility. All right. You select the bidder, and there's a whole process around that. You hire them, you send out that purchase order, and they start the work. This sounds pretty normal right now. And then you have to go out and prove that you got what you're invoiced for. Did they plant the tree? Was it a maple tree? The broken concrete step, you've got an invoice for the repair. Go out and have a look. Has it been fixed? Where we fall short in procurement is when an invoice goes through, and you know what? That we didn't get all the work done. It's not finished yet. Here's one for you. They want a 50% deposit up front for a $10,000 job. We see that all the time. Now, proper procurement would say to you, no problem. We'll give you 50% up front. Provide a security bond. Protect the cash until we have the equivalent of goods or services on site. Now, this may bump a lot of the low or smaller service providers out of business, but there's an obligation, a fiduciary obligation to do what's right for the client and for your constituents, and I would say to you, protecting that short period of time. There was a case some years ago where $100,000 deposit was put down, and then the company promptly went out of business, and the corporation was out of a couple of $100,000. Had a security or performance bond been placed there, there would have been a degree of protection. So we have to prove receipt of goods or services and formalize that. It has to form part of the paperwork, part of that audit trail that I spoke to. And that is what will create full transparency and for years to follow. So that invoice shouldn't just have a check request attached to it. It should have the business case. It should have the specifications. It should have the approvals. It should have a copy of the purchase order. It should have proof of receipt, and now you can pay the bill. Now, it sounds like a lot of work. And this is why, for so many years, condominium corporations and management companies alike have resisted this. What's the mindset of our business? What did it evolve from? It evolved from that cottage industry mentality. And some of those remnants are still staying with us because they're very easy. Human nature is to take the path of least resistance. None of us, directors or managers or even service providers, wake up in the morning and say, now I wonder how we can mess up the lives of those condominium owners. That's not what we do. In fact, many of us, most of us, the majority of us, draw great satisfaction from going to work. A problem arises, we're able to think on our feet, solve the problem, go home and say to our significant others, I made a difference in somebody's life today. That gives you that fuel so that you can take those 30 abusive phone calls for the rest of the week. That's what keeps us going. So the corporate approach. Let's see what we have here. Looking at that little heater in the office, it would have been done a little differently with a formal or corporate approach. So the office being cold is duly minuted at a board meeting, right? The procurement wasn't contemplated in the budget, which means I need approval. There's been no approval made prior to this. Trust me. Trust me. That's what the last car salesman said to me. The procurement, if it's not in the budget and you have a spending limit, that spending limit doesn't give you a blank check to simply go out and expense money. As a director, you need to understand that. As a manager, you need to understand that. If it's in the budget and the budget's been approved, yes, you have that spending authority. You don't have to get multiple quotes. You don't have to get pre-approval. It's only inform the board afterwards. That makes a lot of sense for those minor things that you have to keep going. But if it wasn't in the budget, I don't care if it's a $10 expense. It wasn't approved anywhere previously. You've got to get approval to spend somebody else's money. I was at a lawyer's presentation about 4 months ago, and the lawyer stood up and he said, just $1 expense needs approval of the board. Whether they approved it through the budget and it was contemplated or an allowance was made, or it was minuted at a board meeting or signed off on a purchase order, you need approval. Then we move along. All right, you already have a number of different models and prices, so you're going in there and you've got some different things already laid out. It's just a heater, but you still have to do the due diligence. Here's a model here, this is $30, here's another one. This has a thermostat on it, this is $50, whatever it is. The discussion ensues at the board meeting, probably not very long over a heater. You obtain approval of one of the options at the same meeting, it's minuted. You've shown them pictures, so the specs have been approved, the purchase has been approved, and the order is placed. I'm going to say to you, Amazon is not the best, okay? Because whose credit card is going to pay for that? Typically, it's the managers. It never looks good when a check is made out to a manager. And I'll give you a little hint. If a check is ever made out to a manager for whatever reason, very often we see because of replenishing petty cash, the management company should never sign those checks. If it's made out to the manager, let the director sign it. You need full transparency. And then proof of receipt and payment of the invoice. A lot more formal. If you've been following what I've been saying, it sounds like an awful lot of work. Now, if you're a manager, you're looking at Murray and you're saying, yeah, but I've got periodic information certificates, I've got PICs and NOICs and ICUs, I've got all of these things, I've got a budget coming up, I've got mailings that are going out, or I've got an AGM, I've got all these things going on, and by the way, there's a leak on the 3rd floor. I can't do all of this. But if you don't do all of this, and a year later that director gets on the board or that forensic audit happens and they look at the expense without all of these components, it's reasonable to ask, where's the heater? Must be in their home, right? So it isn't always the way it looks, but we have to make it look right. We have to do it right. I can't lie. I'll tell you that right now. I can't, because my memory's not that good. I can't keep track of lies. So it's so much easier to tell the truth and do it right the first time. In my paid gig, I have 16 regional managers that report to me. And a lot of time the regional managers look at this process and they say, that is so formal, and I got 3 boards that will just never go for it. And I say, all right, tell me about the fires you're putting out. And as they start to say all the little things that they have to get involved in, 75 to 80% of those are rooted in procurement. A disagreement on specifications, no proof of delivery. Some directors got on the board and says, listen, I'm going to hold you accountable. Where's the paperwork? Can't show it. A legitimate expense, but it doesn't look legitimate. So all of this means that as managers, you have to be more prepared in going into the meeting. Well, you're preparing the management report anyway, so you just add a little bit more in there, and you've got what you need. You can do this. And I'll tell you what, many of the fires that you put out, if 75 to 80% of those, I'll call them extracurricular because they're not part of our core process or our core responsibilities, 75 to 80% of those is because procurement. It's procurement that wasn't done right. Some commitment was made on behalf of the corporation to expense some money. You need a full audit trail right from identifying the need all the way through to letting the check go out. And if you're like a lot of the companies that are starting to move that way now, if it's wireless and it's paperless, the end is not paying a check. The end is transferring electronically the payment from the corporation to the service provider. Once you've done that, there's no opportunity to say, oh, wait, I made a mistake. Put a stop payment on the check. It's already done. It's instantaneous. That money is already in their account. And so all the steps to get to that new environment have to be in place. If we can't do it manually, we're never going to do it electronically. So we have to get that mindset. Now, you know, in the industry, it's managers and directors have to learn to live this way. And you can start easy. Just say, all right, the first thing we're going to do is every time we purchase something, I want to see some form of proof of receipt of goods and services. And when you get a handle on that and it's happening, then add another layer and add another layer. Look, we've been doing this since 1967. It's firmly entrenched in us. My mentors taught me that everything I'm telling you you shouldn't do was the way to do things. That's the way I grew up in this industry. And many of us that have the same sort of hairdo that I do lived with those same teachings. So it's a different world now. And we all have to understand that. Directors, I'm going to give you a little bit of warning. Over the years, since the very beginning, when managers started coming on and people realized that for just a few more dollars we could download a little more and a little more and a little more, those days have stopped. Management firms are going to look you right in the eye and say, that's not in the contract, we don't do that. And many times, even though it might be a source of revenue, they're not even going to charge you for it because it's everything we can do to keep up with what we've got and keep your communities running smoothly. And so directors, what was always intended to be partly your job too, is now coming back that way. You're going to see that happen. A lot of involvement at the start of the process, and once proof of receipt is made, if it matches the specs and it matches the price, you don't even need the director anymore. You can release the payment because what they asked for, what they signed on, what they approved is exactly what was received. And so now it becomes much more efficient. We drop the checks, but we pick up the front end involvement a little bit more. And this is just around the corner. You're going to see this industry standardize and standardize very quickly once it starts. It'll be a wave that hit us just like the wave of the recent regulations to the Condominium Act. While I'm at it, I wanted to talk just briefly about petty cash. And I got to tell you that even where I work during the day, we use that phrase petty cash. But it isn't petty cash, ladies and gentlemen. It isn't petty cash. It's a 300 or a 500, whatever it is. It's a float of money. Petty cash typically is addressed as that's cash that you can use for just about anything. It's not reconciled. That's truly what petty cash is. Most companies, most management companies have a rule in place and build it into their contract that they will not handle cash. Cash gets you into trouble all the time. I can remember very, very early in my career coming into the office and there was a little mail slot in the door and I would open that up and see who was complaining about what now. And there was an envelope with $400 without label, that's right. My first thought was, what a lovely gift. What a lovely gift. My second thought was my reputation was worth more than $400. And when when they got their letter for non-payment, they said, but I gave you $400. I gave it cash. Oh, it was you. And then we squared up the books. That's why we don't handle cash. We get into trouble all the time. So why are we handling petty cash? Petty cash it's not really petty cash. It's a reimbursement process. Well, when we ordered the tree or ordered the heater, that's a reimbursement process. So why carry the cash in the office? Why expose the manager to that kind of risk of handling cash? You don't take cash for anything. Why should you be holding cash? Get a corporate credit card. There are protocols you can put in place, procurement rules on how to use a credit card, who can use a credit card, what's the maximum spending, all of those sorts of things. And use the credit card. Now you've got a paper trail, you've got an audit trail, because before you spend it, you got to get approval. Or avoid that altogether and just call up the office supply store and say, send me a box of pens. Right? Or if you have a lot of corporations have grand and toy credit cards, use it that way. Avoid the petty cash if you can. I predict in the next year and a half, petty cash will no longer exist in our industry. If managers start to look at the way they conduct business against their code of ethics and their license, I think you're going to see a lot of people saying, nope, no more petty cash. So I wanted to share with you some sample procurement levels. So if we were looking at procurement and we really wanted to get serious about this, you can't write a policy that talks about every type of purchase in a one-off policy. And so I just threw this together. It's I'm going to tell you it's very close to my heart in one of the projects that I'm working on now. One level is emergencies, and there is a clause in the agency agreement contract that tells you what an emergency is and how it's dealt with. And it's typically not get 3 quotes. I'll call the emergency a 20th floor water leak, and it's starting to run down. Sorry, I can't call 3 directors. I can't get approvals. I'm going to call somebody. I'm going to get that leak stopped. I'm going to call the remediation company, and the third person I'm going to call is one of the directors. Of course, they're probably already calling me because their suite's all wet. Then there's the spending limit. So that's spending within that defined limit. And typically, there's no pre-approval, provided it is noted in the budget. If it isn't noted in the budget, I'm going to tell you, you should be going to the board and getting approval for it. Even if it falls below the spending limit, there are no approvals on record. So you're starting to spend somebody's money without their knowledge. The next one I defined as a spending limit to $49,999. Talk about getting picky. $4,999. At $50,000, if you have a project, you have to alert the Ministry of Labor through a notice of project, which means you're probably looking at a more significant type of project, usually reserve fund, that sort of thing, and you're going to get a project manager to do that. Because you know what? The project manager isn't going to project manage anymore. Our insurance has gone up like crazy just to cover what the regulations say we have to do. We're not going to step outside of that coverage and start doing other things that take us away from that. It's called lost opportunity. You ask us to do that, we're not doing all the other things that our contract says we should. And so there has to be some equity. It's a cost of doing business to hire a professional to come in. But in that middle range, that's where we get into trouble sometimes. I'll tell you a story I heard not that long ago. Condominium Corporation had an atrium ceiling, glass panels, older building. Somewhere up there was a leak. Called in a glass company to come and look at that, certainly within the spending limit. And because it was leaking, I would classify that as an emergency. So there was about a $2,000 call, and they said, nope, it's not that. It's 6 panels. And then they started moving along. That grew into a $200,000 drop with no approvals anywhere along the process. Now, was it justified? Yes. Did it need to be done? Yes. Should it have been done that way? Absolutely not. Anybody goes in and looks at that sort of a procurement later on, they're going to start saying, how do I know it was 10 panels? Maybe it was 1. Where did the money go? A lot of questions come up, and they're reasonable questions to ask. Then there's the CCDC managed projects, so there's that one, and I talked about that. And then there's continuous contracts. So those ones, security, management, cleaning, HVAC, don't know who else there might be on that. On those ones, it gets a little harder to think about proof of receipt of goods or services. But a simple sign-in sheet where somebody signs in, the cleaners have their keys, they have to sign the keys out, you can attach that log. Look, they were here every day. You know, and then you have inspection reports maybe that the manager presents to the board and the building looks pretty clean. That's something that could be attached. There's been some attempt to show proof of receipt of goods or services, even in the continuous contract mode. So I think that level, each of the levels that I'm talking about, could have sort of their own little protocol written about them, rather than try to encompass all of those in one single protocol. And then finally, we get down to utilities and regulatory payments. And I said regulatory payments because there's that 75 cents per door per month that we have to pay to the CAO. There may be other fines, or there may be regulatory payments that just have to be made, and utilities. And utilities more and more are becoming pre-authorized with review before the date where the money will be taken out. So I'll take the questions at the end. And so with utilities, again, because it is very often pre-approved fund transfer, you want to make sure that you have a policy written around that. But I'll tell you what, just throwing this up here like this, I think most people could say just about every expense in a condominium falls in one of those categories. Every one. And if you look at just one category, it becomes easy to say, I can write some protocols and some conditions and rules around that one category. It's a manageable bite out of the whole procurement process. For a firm, you have to start putting in place your procurement policy, which is an overriding statement, and then start building these policies and protocols underneath. That makes sense? It's a lot of work. It's a lot of administration work. But over the years, managers have learned that when the board says, oh, I'd like this, we just jump in and say, oh, yeah, we can do that for you. We can do that for you. But with everything that's out there now, the manager's time, look, if you've got them for 40 hours a week, they got to get everything into 40 hours. If you put something else on them, some part of that core service is going to drop out. And so paying for that project manager or paying for that professional opinion now becomes a way of protecting procurement policies and the funds of the corporation. There's a saying I have, listen, the only thing more expensive than a professional is an amateur. And you can usually tell the differential by the price, right? Hey, why do we bring in someplace like someone like Rainbow International or one of them to come in and do a flood remediation? Joe down the street's got a brand new pickup and 6, count them, 6 shop vacs, and he can do it for a couple of $100. You know what's coming a year later, right? The call to get the mold removed. So what was cheaper? So I throw this up there. I think that whether you name it this is probably the categories that the industry will start to fall into, and you're going to see some strict protocols come out of that, because managers are going to have to protect their license and their insurance premiums. And so they're going to start putting protocols in almost as a self-protection mechanism. But this isn't self-protection, this is industry protection. What's good for the manager is good for the corporation. I could change that. What's good for the corporation is good for the manager. We just have to take all of those people that have been doing it the same way since 1970 and start to teach them that it's different. And some of the managers that are here today, your mentors were teaching you a little differently. They weren't throwing in some of these formal approaches, but we need to do it. We're going to do it. And before long, it's going to be a way of life. And we'll all look back at the way we used to do things and say, I can't believe we did that. You know, years ago when I first entered this business, it was mostly townhouses that I looked after. And in those days, we would go into a board meeting, and we would tell the board what they're going to approve, and they'd go, okay. And then we'd carry on business for the month. Those days are long gone, ladies and gentlemen. The education level has come up considerably for managers, for directors, and for owners who demand more from the board than they ever have before. There's a couple of directors here. I know I've sat through AGMs. I've chaired some of the AGMs for some of you in the room. And I can tell you, it's very, very clear. Owners are demanding so much more, and they're questioning more. So, how to prepare for the regs? Well, let's see. Like 1967, we don't know what we don't know, right? We don't know. But like 2019, we know what we can anticipate. We have an inkling of what we need to know. Unlike 1967, we're in a much more litigious environment. Even in my firm, I can tell you that about once a week, we're served. Good news is about once a week we're able to prove them wrong, but nonetheless, all of that costs money. That costs lawyers. We need to start identifying those levels of procurement. You can call it what you want, but those categories, I think, are pretty industry standard if you're going to look at how you want to break it down. You need, as a management company and as a board, to develop procurement protocols and policies. One of the things I see in almost every management contract is the requirement that there be a board liaison to management. So somebody on the board is going to be the voice that's always in contact with management. And can that director come in and approve a $10,000 expense? Truthfully, ladies and gentlemen, the answer is probably yes, unless the corporation has developed a protocol that said the board liaison will operate this way. Or our procurement policy prohibits this, or prohibits that, or requires this, or requires that. You almost need to take yourself to the lowest common denominator and say, that's what we're going to address, because for everything else, they're already doing some degree of that. I really haven't talked a lot about vetting vendors, other than get quorum, because I already know about them. I want to tell you a little story. I was talking to an engineering firm because as in my day job is we're looking at procurement and trying to tighten it up and get better at what we're doing and provide a better service to our clients. We asked the question, we said, engineers have all of these trades. So let's call an engineer, because I'm sure when you're dealing with, a $3 or $4 million project, the vetting process must be really good. So I called up the 3 largest firms. I don't have to say any more than that. The 3 largest firms in the GTA. And I asked them, how do you vet your vendors? It hurt me to hear the response. Well, Murray, we've been using them for years. I'm good. I said, is there no formal process? They said, oh yeah, there's a CCDC 11. I said, can you flip me a copy? Those CCDC documents you have to buy. So, can you flip me a copy? Sure. So he sent me a copy, but it had the client's name all blanked out. It was redacted. And I looked at this thing. How long have you been in business? How many condominiums have you worked for? How many similar projects have you done? That was it. There's only about 8 questions on a CCDC 11 vendor vetting document. And I thought, in the absence of just simply saying, well, I've known them for years, they've done hundreds of jobs, they're okay, all the way up to the more formal answer 8 questions. We should be asking questions like, has the principal of the company ever been arrested for fraud? Has the company ever operated under another name? And if you look through, again, you talk to my good friend Google, there are lots of versions of proper vetting. It's not enough to say, industry standard, honest to goodness, industry standard. Is your WSIB up to date? And do you have liability insurance? And have you worked for another condominium, right? There you go, good to go, let's hire that one. No, that's not the way to go. So there's a whole process around that, and I would suggest to the management side anyway, the fiduciary obligation we have to our clients and the expectation from the clients is that we're vetting vendors better than that. That also speaks to the directors who, after you've gone through the whole tendering and bid process, who say, hold on, my brother-in-law can do it a lot cheaper than that. There are actually legal ramifications about treating tendering that way. So let's see. Procurement regulations and the regulations to the Condominium Act. How soon are they coming along? We heard at the 2018 Condominium Conference, the minister told us as we were walking the floor that he was very concerned about procurement practices and protection of the consumer's money. So we really hoped that there would be some really strong wording in the regulations to govern how procurement's done. And what have you seen so far? I haven't seen anything so far. No. Some of us have been embarrassed. Doesn't matter how big or how small the company is, when somebody goes back and looks at some of those loosely approached practices for procurement and says, what was this all about? There isn't an audit trail. You can't even answer the basic questions. So it's pretty embarrassing. We know what has to be done. You've heard me talk about it today. I don't think a lot of what I said today is new to you, except to say that it should all come together. And managers and boards have both resisted this formalized approach. Look, as managers are very entrepreneurial in that every day is different. It's not structured, maybe office hours, but the things that we deal with every day, we're thinking on our feet. We're you know, if we'd be good boxers. You know, we're light on our feet and ducking and all of those sorts of things and getting things done. We can't resist this anymore. We have to do this for boards and for managers. Once we're firmly on the other side of the line and we're immersed in this environment, all of those projects and problems that we deal with, a lot of them are going to go away because most of them are rooted in procurement. The cost of errors is a heck of a lot more expensive than the cost of doing it right the first time. It's time we leave the cottage, right? It's time we leave the cottage behind and come into the boardroom. I don't know if I scared you, I don't know if I bored you, but this is a project that I'm working on. I hope that my involvement in this project will change the industry. I hope that it'll be a catalyst. And I truly believe and I'm not trying to build up my company, but we're the largest. And I think that if the rest of the community, the condo community in Ontario, understands that what I've talked to you today is a real project that's about halfway done right now, I believe that the smaller companies are going to look at us and say, let the big guy figure it out, let the big guy make the mistakes, let the big guy get the wrinkles out of it, and when the big guy has got it going good, we'll just copy it. It's a lot cheaper than having Murray on payroll trying to figure it out. We see that a lot. So I really hope that what I've spoke to you about today, you'll be able, within the next 2 years, you'll be able to say, I was at a little session down on the Ryerson campus, and Murray predicted this.
My question to you is this, and it's not very clear to me, and I'm going through this process right now, and it is, can a board member, a board of three board members only, vote on the repairs to their own unit and be part of that procurement process? Do they have to recruit themselves, or can they be a part of that process? It's a $50,000 foundation wall repair. The board is doesn't want to get an engineer, as recommended by, management. So they want to exclude an engineer, and the person that is having the foundation wall done is on the board, and got on the board so she could get the wall done, just to add that layer to it.
Well, it's not unusual that somebody comes to a board, gets themselves elected with a single agenda, right? It happens. We're all human beings, so it's no surprise there. There's a couple of errors through that whole process on both sides, on the board and on those directors. Look, if I'm going to sit down in a discussion with you to talk about spending your money on something I own, that's a classic definition of a conflict of interest. There's no way around it. You can't sugarcoat it. That's a conflict of interest. They should recuse themselves completely right from the room. But if you have 2 out of 3, now how do you lose quorum when they both leave? So how do you make a decision? That's where the second mistake is made. This should be an engineer. I told you, the only thing more expensive than a professional is an amateur. Somebody needs to develop the specs. Let the engineer manage it, and then it takes the conflict away from the board. Okay? Let the engineer set the tone.
Hey, Murray, thank you for this. We touched a little bit on Amazon and personal credit cards. Also, you had a line item on there with respect to corporate credit cards. What are your thoughts on those corporate credit cards? Typically have to have a board member's name on it. So what are the perception of that? If there's points usually accumulated on that, how do you handle that with respect to everybody else? A little bit of gain here versus using corporate credit card.
You're right. You have to do a cost-risk analysis, right? But you have to have those written protocols in place, because now it's a credit card, right? By the way, not a gold credit card. So you've got this credit card, you've got the rules set around it, you've got directors that are signing off on that, you've got a management company maybe that's signing off on that. The resistance to credit cards has always been that a director's name needs to be on it. But let me just change it from calling it a credit card to calling it a bank account. As soon as you get on the board, you sign some documents, there's a new bylaw made, and now you've got signing authority. Now you're going to leave the board. What do? We take your name off, we put a new person on, we go through the whole process again. That's how corporate credit cards are handled. So if the person who's the primary responsibility for that, and if you have a formal protocol in place approved by the board, and I would say shared with the owners, then you're actually relieving that director of the liability as long as that director doesn't break the law, right? So you've got to have those protocols in place. I think that for management companies, if you want to get ahead of the curve, start thinking about and start talking to our lawyer friends, how can we develop generic protocols to handle corporate credit cards, and just provide them to our clients, and then they can massage it. But the idea is you walk in with this mindset that we're going to formalize this process, and then you tell your accounting department you don't process anything unless all of these components are in place.
Great job, Murray.
Thank you.
First, an observation. Most of what you say is already well enshrined in public sector expense tracking and controls.
Absolutely.
Whether it be City Hall or anywhere else. But could you comment about the role of back office? You've made excellent statements about the role of frontline manager, but complementing a manager in any mid to large size management company is a back office, typically with many people and probably many hands going through the entry or the paper flow. Where do you say is the role of back office in these controls?
So I talked to you about the different levels of procurement, right? I think I put up 6 or 7 there. Emergency, spending limit, et cetera. Each of those from a management operation, so from the management's corporate side, needs to develop these protocols, and these protocols give instructions to the back end, and not just to accounting, but to supervisory staff and senior staff, that this is the way we're going to process this type of payment. And if these steps aren't in there, then that payment isn't going to get processed. Now, trust me, I think that as the back end, and I've seen even in my own firm where the back end has come and said, look, I got a manager and 3 directors that have called me today, and they want us to cut a check for a couple of $100,000. We said, great, okay, no problem. So let's see the board, duly called board meeting where the board approved this, not a director. Let's see the contract. If this is a deposit, let's see the security bond protecting this money. Because you know what? If we cut the check, look, the client asked for it, it's their money. But if we cut that check and something goes south, the client's going to come after us for the $200,000 or whatever it may be. Well, we don't want that exposure. So in sort of a self-protection mode, we're actually putting in place the conditions that are required to protect the client's money. Look, it's not going to be an easy transition from where we are today. And I'm not saying every firm is doing everything the wrong way. Look, we've grown up with this industry. We're good at what we do for the most part. In this part, we've got to get better because of the current environment. So that back end, there's protocols and processes and different levels of procurement and how they're addressed as an internal check and balance. And then the same thing, the same sort of levels have to have some sort of site level policy or procurement around it. So both sides have bought in to the core requirement. That's where I think the back ends come. And in my firm, and I know that you've been in our firm, the back end catches things like that all the time. And especially the big funds where the corporation wants to make an investment. They want to transfer an investment, right? So we're going to transfer from surplus, we're going to put $250,000 into investments. We need that check cut today. Well, we don't cut a check that big. We do a fund transfer. And so there's a lot of checks and balances all through the way. And our clients get mad at us. And when my accounting team gets beat up, I get on the phone and I say, why are you getting mad at us? We're protecting your money. We want to do it. We just have to do it the right way. Right? So we're going to see a lot of that over the next 18 months or so as the firms start to come in and start to get a little bit more formalized, or my word, a little more corporate.
All right, everybody, last question here before we wrap it up.
Two little comments. In part of your conversation, you mentioned to the boards that you've got this manager for 40 hours a week. Where's that place where you can work as a manager for 40 hours only? Can I have the address?
I thought I'd slip that one through, but
Okay.
too many managers in the room.
Okay. The suggestion, the concept is great. It's aiming at standardizing and making sure that things are happening the right way. And I don't think it's fair for one person to carry all the load and then the rest of the participants copy it. Has it ever been considered to do this work, to do this preparation and putting together of ideas, most of which are already bits and pieces in place, together in a group approach, something like under the umbrella of Canadian Condominium Institute or Association of Condo Managers of Ontario, something that will be from the get-go stamped and approved by in my opinion, the two leaders of the industry. Has it been considered?
No. That's the short answer, no. Listen, it's especially with the bigger management companies, we don't face the same competition that Tier 2 or Tier 3 management companies do. We're in a position where we can say we want this client or we don't want this client. You know what? No, we're not going to get into that. They're too small, they're too big, they have too many problems, whatever it may be. So we're in that position. So it's competitive within our level, but it has to start within the individual company. And I say that because, look, if you're asking me how I'm going to design my processes, I'm going to design it around Yardi. That's the software platform I use. And I'm building the process, the procurement process, to eventually go to a paperless process. Right? So that's a big step. But there's a lot of internal change. Believe me, I'm having enough on my hands with internal change to then say to somebody like Dell or First Service, hey, come on over, let's work together. And I won't just deal with my 300 managers, I'll deal with your 200 and your 200. It'll never get done. So somebody's got to grab it and go with it. And listen, look, we're not squeaky clean on this. In the past, there's been some real big embarrassments for us, and I don't want them to happen again. So I'm learning from and building from experience. And then look around, as I said, look around at it was mentioned over here. I started with the school board. That was a mistake. A typical specification for the school board is not by the number of pages, it's by how many pounds it weighs. These things are terrible. That's way too much for our industry. But I also know that what we're doing now is way too little. So we got to find that happy medium. Here's my thought process. Once I get it in place, once I get over the reaction to change, the first reaction to change is called a burst. It's an emotional reaction. You got to let that run its course. Then people will start to see the benefits. Eventually, a lot of the fires they're working on will disappear because you're not creating it through improper procurement. And then at that point, I'm going to have 300 ambassadors to go out into the industry to say, this really works, it really did make my job easier, and it really does protect the client's money. So that's why we haven't gone out. Besides, if I call a meeting of 3 or 4 principals and we all come together and somebody gets wind of that, the first thing they'll say is, that's collusion. So I want to be really careful I don't create another problem while I'm solving this one.
Murray, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
Thank you all.